Good afternoon. On this afternoon's Intelligence Forum's Who Are You podcast, we're privileged to have Dr. Matthew Niblett, who's director of the Independent Transport Commission, a well-respected think tank on transport and travel. I'd like to ask the first question, Matthew. What has been your professional journey to where you are today?
Thank you, Harry. It's a pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you today. I suppose I've always had a keen interest in research and particularly using data and evidence to try and understand the world in a better way. And I began with a fairly conventional academic career and journey. First of all, I did postgraduate research work for a doctorate in on Enlightenment history, and that was then followed with postdoctoral research. And it was around that time that an opportunity came up to get involved with a very small research charity stroke think tank called the Independent Transport Commission, which at that time was a very small outfit. And it nevertheless sort of struck me as an interesting opportunity, particularly that it was focused on public policy issues. And it's been a real privilege and an exciting journey over the last more than a decade now, as we've built up the ITC into what we'd like to think is the country's main pan-transport think tank and research charity. And it's been great through that to engage with policymakers and really, I think, use the work that the ITC does to try and change policy making for the better.
I mean, tell us a bit more about your work in the Independent Transport Commission and some of the effects you've had on transport policy.
Thank you indeed. Well, to give a little bit of background, the ITC was originally set up back in 1999 as an independent alternative to the government's transport think tank, which was funded out of the Department for Transport. It was called the Commission for Integrated Transport. Around the time when I joined the ITC, it was around the time when the coalition government was formed, and they were getting rid of a lot of quangos at the time as part of their austerity measures. And that included finishing off the Commission for Integrated Transport. So there's an opportunity there for the ITC to step into that role and really become a platform for research and debate around transport and land use. And so that's really what we've been focusing on over the past more than a decade. And I think we have been able to have, I think, some very important influence on a number of policy debates. Perhaps I could just give a few examples. One study we did was looking at the relationship between high-speed rail investment and cities. And we did that by looking at the existing experience of high-speed rail in European cities, particularly in Northwest Europe, France, Netherlands, Belgium, etc. And we took study groups out, including people from local and national government, to see what had been achieved there and try and build that into the process for getting the High Speed 2 legislation put forward. And that was, I think, very eye-opening for many of the civil servants, and also I think helped to ensure that in the cities which High Speed 2 was originally due to serve, plans were made to try and get the best of that and out of that. Of course, sadly, since then, High Speed 2 and High Speed Rail generally has been downgraded under Rishi Sunak, and it doesn't look as though that's going to come back anytime soon. But nonetheless, I think it showed the potential that's there from that kind of investment. A second area we've always been very interested in has been travel behaviour and changing travel trends. And I think one of the most interesting pieces of work we were involved in just before the pandemic was looking at the reasons for the massive growth in rail travel, and particularly trying to understand what factors affected that from outside the rail industry, getting beyond this debate about whether the massive growth in rail travel was due to privatization or not. And we looked at factors such as, for example, changes in the employment structure, changes in where people are living, changes in where jobs were located. And we found that those factors actually accounted for about 40 to 45% of the growth, the massive growth in rail travel we've seen over the past 25 years up until the pandemic. So I think that demonstrated that planning and land use policies can really have, and economic policies indeed, can have a really important impact upon how people travel and what modes they choose to use. And perhaps if I may quickly, a third is we've always had a strong interest in aviation and aviation research. And I recall well and as you might too, the whole debate about airport expansion, which is back on the agenda now under the new government. And the work we did there was trying to think about what were the needs of Britain in terms of aviation connectivity, which helped to sort of demonstrate that actually a major hub airport does bring all kinds of benefits beyond simply passenger connectivity, but there's also issues in terms of freight. There's also issues in terms of efficiency that are gained from that. And I think that again we fed that into the commission that was looking at airport expansion. I think that that helped to sway their views in favour of the importance of a hub airport. We also like to promote debate, and we do that through events such as our annual lecture, such as the discussion webinars and discussion dinners with key experts that we regularly hold, and try and use that to bring together, I think, people from outside just a single mode and outside even just the transport industry, but to try and get a holistic range of views on topics and feed those into decision makers and civil servants.
Thank you very much indeed, Matthew. So you mentioned the word pandemic. What lasting changes, in your view, to transport did the recent pandemic have on transport?
That's a very good question, Harry. And we, at the ITC, released last year a study which was exploring the longer term impacts of the pandemic, the footprint, if you like, of the pandemic on travel behavior and land use. I think the first and most important, perhaps lasting impact of the pandemic has been the permanent move towards more flexible working practices. And that's had a big impact upon the kind of travel people do and also when they do it. We've seen a big shift across all modes in terms of the post-pandemic situation, which has continued today in terms of lower levels of commuting than used to be the case, but a corresponding increase actually in leisure travel. And that has had a number of major impacts across the industry, one of which, of course, has been on the time of day when people travel. We're finding, for instance, that weekend travel, both on the roads and on public transport, has become, demand has increased. So the roads are busier at the weekends, public transport is busy at the weekends. At the same time, there's been a slight reduction in peak hour travel, particularly on public transport. So the nature of the peak, as we used to call it, has changed. That has had, I should say, sort of knock-on impacts on public transport, which have been quite serious in some ways. For instance, the business model and the ticketing model that was used was very much based, for instance, on rail, around squeezing the commuter, people who are sort of forced to travel for work. And of course, the changes in travel patterns after the pandemic have really had a quite serious impact upon revenue from ticket sales in rail, and that has required a bigger subsidy to keep rail going. That's all being currently rethought as part of the move towards the Great British Railways structure, which will replace Network Rail. But it's certainly provided a lot of food for thought amongst the powers that be in rail. And perhaps another longer term aspect, although it's not only due to the pandemic, has been inflation and the cost of living. Obviously, that's been partly due to issues such as the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, but it also reflects, I think, a legacy of supply chain disruptions during the pandemic and the massive government spending we saw during the pandemic too. And that increase in the cost of living has meant obviously that people's disposable incomes in real terms are not as great as they were. And I think that has slightly suppressed transport demand compared to the pre-pandemic situation. So that's a flavour of some of the issues that have arisen.
I'm just curious about one other thing on this subject, and that is the Mondays and Fridays.
Mhm.
Have you noticed a change in transport, suburban travel, for example, or commuting travel in and out of, for example, London and other cities on those days?
Yes, I mean, and certainly in the first years after the pandemic, there was seemed to be a definite reduction in Monday and Friday travel. Friday was, I should say, anyway before the pandemic, a weaker day in terms of certain kinds of demand, particularly for certainly for commuting. Um, but interestingly, actually, I don't think generally the decline on Mondays and Fridays today is as much as perhaps have been feared by some in the industry, and that's partly because, particularly on Fridays, leisure travel has
Mm.
increased significantly, and you're seeing people traveling for leisure trips more on Friday, which has made up for some of that loss in demand from end of week commuting.
Thank you. And how will the push towards net zero carbon affect the future of transport in Britain?
Very topical issue indeed. I think obviously one of the main aspects about the net zero targets is the impact upon road vehicles. We know from the Climate Change Committee that if we're to meet their targets, there's going to have to be a massive change in terms of the move towards electric vehicles, not only for cars, but also for vans and good vehicles too. And the targets for those have been astonishingly ambitious. I think there is going to be inevitably a transition because government policy is pushing towards that. I don't think it's going to be quite as perhaps fast as the Climate Change Committee would like. It's going to be, I think, more happen slightly more slowly than predictions had forecast even 2 or 3 years ago. And that's partly because the cost of electric vehicles hasn't come down as fast as I think the net zero target setters had hoped. We're doing some work at the moment, for instance, on the impacts of this, and one of the problems has been that the upfront costs of pure electric vehicles, as in um, electric only vehicles, are still too high for many people to make that change, and the range as well is still not really comparable with an internal combustion engine. But what we are seeing is a move driven by the manufacturers towards a kind of hybrid vehicles where you have bigger batteries in the car to help increase efficiency and power the car for small distances when you tend to be burning most inefficiently fuels. Beside that, I suppose if we're going to meet net zero targets, then there's likely to have to be an element of demand suppression, particularly in terms of aviation. Uh, it's not at all clear how that's going to be managed. Even the Labour government is not very keen on really sort of pursuing that. So I think there are some doubts about how politically acceptable it's going to be for that to happen. But it may happen through the fact that airlines are going to have to be using much more in terms of sustainable aviation fuels. Those are much more expensive than conventional kerosene. So it may simply be that the cost of flying is going to be increasing quite significantly in real terms anyway over the next 10 to 15 years, which will be suppressing demand simply through the price mechanism. Um, and then finally, I suppose the impact of the net zero targets is that we're going to need much more capacity on public transport. There's going to clearly need to be much more investment in that, and more subsidies for that if we're going to achieve some of these targets, as I think the government is now recognizing.
In many respects, exciting times. Brings me to the next question. Are there intergenerational differences in travel behaviour? And what will this mean for the future shape of travel and transport?
Well, this is a very interesting question indeed, and there's been a number of interesting pieces of work on this recently. I'm thinking, for instance, of that by Professor Kiran Chatterjee at University of West of England, which and the work the ITC indeed has done on travel trends has uncovered some of these aspects too. Perhaps one of the most striking issues is that younger people are progressively less likely than older generations, first of all, to hold a driving license, secondly, to actually be car owners. So that is going to feed its way, I think, sort of into ever more into sort of the statistics as some younger generations age and new ones replace them. And that has implications, obviously, for a range of issues, including how we travel. I mean, it's likely to mean greater demand for public transport in the future. But also, I think it means that there's interesting opportunities, for instance, for the way in which vehicles are used on the roads. We know that for instance, younger people are also more likely to be Uber users and involved in shared ownership sort of schemes. So the advent of initiatives such as robo taxis and car sharing clubs, I think, is going to become ever stronger. I think it's also worth pointing out, though, that younger people are, in real terms, poorer in terms of wealth and income than other older generations were at the same age in real terms. And that means that they don't have as much disposable income for travel and other activities. And we're seeing that reflected in the way in which younger people today, compared to previous generations, are much more likely to stay at home. They're less likely, they have a lower propensity to travel generally. We talk about this in terms of other factors as well. They're lower, they consume less alcohol than previous generations did at the same age. It's one of the reasons why we're seeing so many pubs closing, for example. So this all has, an impact upon the travel choices that are being made. So, I think there are clearly significant intergenerational differences, which are going to have, I think, quite a significant impact upon the future shape of travel over the next 30 or 40 years.
And then the last question I'd like to ask you, which is of great interest to myself, what are the challenges facing passenger transport in Britain, and how can we encourage more people to use buses, trains, and trams?
Well, this is it's been a perennial kind of issue for policymakers. I mean, I think there are some different dynamics at play on the different modes and different challenges they faced. I mean, rail actually has been tremendously successful, at least up until the pandemic, in terms of passenger growth. Indeed, it's easy to forget that on the eve of the pandemic, there were real problems with capacity and capacity constraints on the rail network. Because demand was so high and we were facing so many problems with overcrowding. The problem that rail has, and quite a bit of that demand has indeed sort of bounced back, but the problem that rail has at the moment is a funding one. Ticket revenues have declined for some of the reasons we discussed previously. And it seems clear that in looking forward, rail is going to require a greater subsidy than was the case in the first 2 decades of this century. In addition to that, clearly there needs to be more investment in rail in order to maintain good levels of service. So there needs to be a sort of public buy-in, I think, to the value of public transport and to the value of spending taxpayer money on it. With something like bus, it's a bit different. Bus has been suffering in terms of a gradual decline in demand for quite a long time now, certainly since the start of this century. The only places where it's not seen a decline are in some of the more affluent cities in the south. That's partly because younger people are in places like Brighton and Bristol and Reading and Oxford, actually more reliant on bus use than in other parts of the country, and really seem to be making more use of it. But generally, there is an issue with bus demand, and that it's not perhaps there's an issue with trying to get people back onto the buses, and trying to encourage them to do that. There's also an issue of funding with bus use. At the moment, a great deal of weight is put on local authorities to subsidise bus travel, and clearly that's becoming unsustainable, particularly as local authorities are increasingly being squeezed in terms of their finances. The government's cap on bus fares has been very helpful, at least in keeping demand up a bit since the pandemic. But again, I think there needs to be, perhaps particularly in the UK, a sort of perhaps a campaign to get people to appreciate the value of public transport and see it as a public good much more. If you go to France, Germany, Switzerland, there's real pride in their public transport systems, and in political terms, at least, a much greater sort of willingness to see this as a public good, which taxpayer money should be spent on. I fear the political dynamics in here are quite troubling, particularly when you see, for instance, the Reform Party talking about a Doge-style kind of attack on public spending, which could well decimate sort of public transport. So there are real concerns ahead about how public transport is going to be funded, and I think there's a real need for a campaign both to increase demand and increase the acceptability of public funding of transport.
Just one last small thing. Will the climate debate help railways get more subsidy?
Potentially. I think the problem with the climate debate has been that there are a lot of propositions that are pushed forward, but perhaps not enough public buy-in to them. And there's still much more work, I think, that needs to be done in terms of helping people to understand the necessity of the changes, as well as the sort of value of using, for instance, rail rather than car. The concern is that because the climate debate is becoming very heavily politicized, other consequences of that might well mean that if you tell people that they have to travel by rail because of the climate, in many cases that's a turn off rather than a turn on. So perhaps in terms of encouraging rail travel, we need to be using a wide range of arguments, not merely the climate one.
So, Dr. Matthew Niblett, thank you very much indeed for joining this Intelligence Forum's Who Are You podcast this afternoon. It's just a tremendous privilege to have you. Thank you.
It's been a huge pleasure, Harry. Thank you for inviting me.
I would also like to, at the end of this meeting, thank Christina Scheck, who, as I've often said before, without her, nothing would happen. Thank you, Christina.